My brother called me from the driveway of our father's house 11 days after the funeral and said, "Congratulations, it's all taken care of." I asked what he meant. He said the house, the accounts, all of it. He said Dad would have wanted it handled quickly. He said I should not worry about anything. He said it in the smooth, rapid way he said things when he had already done them, and was informing me rather than discussing. I said, "What exactly did you take care of?" He said, "Just the paperwork." I said, "What paperwork?" He said, "Isabelle, it's fine, I handled it." I said, "Ryan, what did you sign?" There was a pause that lasted approximately 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds I understood something had already happened that I could not undo by asking about it. What I did not know yet was that my passport would be the thing that undid it for me. Before I go on, if this story connects with something real in your life, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely feel it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. My name is Isabelle, I am 28 years old, and this is the story of how a document signed in my name on a day I was standing in an airport in Portugal became the most important piece of evidence in a case that gave me back what my brother decided was already his. Now let me take you back to the beginning, not the phone call in the driveway. Before that, to the house on Dalton Street in Columbus, Ohio, where my father raised 2 children after my mother left when I was 4 and Ryan was 9. My father's name was Thomas. He worked in commercial printing for 31 years, and he was a quiet man in the specific way that quiet men are when they have decided that most of what needs to be said can be said in fewer words than people typically use. He had a dog named Walter for 11 years who died the year before he did, and he had a garden in the backyard that he maintained with more care than he gave most other things. And he had strong opinions about coffee and about what constituted a properly made sandwich. And he loved both of his children in the way that people love when they have not been given very good models of how to say it out. Loud, and so they show it, instead through showing up and staying and being reliably there. I want to tell you about Dalton Street in a way that helps you understand why it mattered as much as it did. It is a residential street in East Columbus with older houses built in the 1960s and 1970s that have the specific solidity of houses built when people intended to stay in them. Wide lots, covered porches, garages attached by breezeways that architects in that era considered a necessary amenity and that have mostly been converted into storage by the people who live there now. Frank across the street has lived there since 1994. The Harrises on the corner since 1989. The woman at the far end, named Ruth, who is 82 and has a small dog and a very large opinion about where people park, has been there since 1978. It is a street where people know the names of other people's dogs and where someone puts a note in your mailbox if they see a branch has fallen on your roof, and where my father had walked to the end and back most evenings for 27 years and had been known by the people he passed as Tom with the garden because that is what he was. The house had a specific value in both the literal and the less literal senses. In the literal sense, the appraisal came in at $214,000 for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath with an attached garage and the garden in the back and the uneven blue tile in the kitchen. In the less literal sense, it was the place where my father had measured himself as a person against 27 years of winters and springs and the slow growth of something he had planted himself. Ryan had wanted both kinds of value. He had wanted the $214,000, and he had wanted the address and the street and the neighbor who offers the pressure washer and the position of being the one the house went to. I understand wanting those things. I do not understand taking them through a document signed in someone else's name in a notary's office while that person was drinking bad coffee in Lisbon airport waiting for a connecting flight and had no idea any of it was happening. Ryan is 5 years older than me. He is 33 now. He is a person who has always been very good at the visible performance of competence without always being equally good at the underlying work that competence is supposed to represent. He managed our father's affairs during the last 2 years of my father's illness with an efficiency that looked from the outside like devotion, and that contained, I now understand, a great deal of advanced positioning. He organized things. He was the one who knew the name of every doctor and every account and every document. He was the one at the appointments. He was the one my father called first. I was in Seattle. I had moved there 3 years before for a job in environmental consulting that I was good at, and that I had built carefully, and that required me to be where I was. I flew home 4 times in those 2 years. I called my father every other day. I was present in the ways that I could be present from 2,000 miles away. Ryan was present in the ways that left visible marks and that our father could see, and that positioned Ryan by the end as the child who had stayed and shown up in the specific visible daily way that our father understood and valued. My father was diagnosed with a progressive heart condition when I was 25. He declined to tell me how serious it was for the first 6 months because he did not want me to worry, and because he was a man who had specific rules about not being a burden, and because he had already told Ryan and had decided that one child knowing was sufficient for the moment. I found out the full picture when I flew home for Thanksgiving and sat with his cardiologist and understood for the first time what the word progressive actually meant in this context. I drove from the hospital to the house on Dalton Street, and I sat in the kitchen that had the same blue tile since 1997, and I looked at the garden through the window, brown and quiet in November, and I thought about what I was allowed to feel about the 6 months I had not known. I stayed for 2 weeks that visit. Ryan came for dinner twice and was warm and helpful and managed the conversations the way he managed most things, with a forward momentum that felt like competence and functioned as a way of not lingering on any particular thing long enough to examine it. My father was glad to have us both there. He was a person who did not express gladness in the way people typically express it, but you could see it in the specific way he sat when the people he loved were in the room. A kind of settled quality, a slight easing, the way a person's posture changes when they have set something down they had been carrying. The following 2 years had the texture of a thing you know is ending without being able to see exactly where the end is. I flew home 4 times. I called every other day. Ryan managed everything on the ground with the focused efficiency of someone who understands that managing everything on the ground creates a specific kind of claim. I am not saying he was calculated about this from the beginning. I am saying that by the end, the management had become the relationship, and the relationship had become the expectation, and the expectation had become the assumption that what came after would reflect the visible arithmetic of who had been present and by whose measure. My father died in March. I flew home immediately. Ryan met me at the airport and we drove to the house together, and the drive was quiet in the specific way that drives are quiet when 2 people are carrying the same loss and do not have the words for it yet and are both slightly afraid of what happens when the words do come. We sat in the kitchen together that evening and we ate food that neighbors had brought, and we did not talk about anything that mattered, and I thought, this is fine. There is time. The funeral was on a Thursday. 83 people came, people who had worked with my father, neighbors from Dalton Street who had known the house for decades, 3 men from his bowling league who cried in the parking lot in the specific way that older men cry when they think no one is watching. A woman named June, who had been the receptionist at his company for 20 years, and who told me in a single sentence that your father talked about you all the time with the specific firmness of someone who wants to make sure you understand that the sentence is true. Ryan gave a speech. He was composed and precise, and he said the right things. He said our father was a man who showed up. He said our father believed in reliability. He said our father had given him the tools to be the person he was. I sat in the front pew and listened, and I thought that all of this was true, and that none of it was all of the truth, and that the gap between what was true and what was all of the truth was the size of a house on Dalton Street. 11 days after the funeral, Ryan called from the driveway and told me it was all taken care of. I said, "What exactly did you sign?" He said a quitclaim deed transferring the property and some financial accounts. He said it was straightforward estate administration. I said, "Did you sign my name?" He said I handled it as executor. I said, "Ryan, I need to see the documents." He said, "There is nothing to see." I said, "There is a document with my name on it and I need to see it." Another pause. He said, "I will email you a copy." The copy arrived 40 minutes later. I looked at it for a long time. My signature was on the document. It was in the signature line labeled Isabelle Thomas, secondary owner. It was dated March 22nd. I scrolled back through my phone calendar. March 22nd. I had flown to Lisbon on March 20th for a work conference. I had been in Portugal from March 20th to March 27th. I had been standing in an airport departure lounge at 7 in the morning on March 22nd, drinking bad coffee and waiting for a connecting flight when this document, according to its execution date and notarization, had been signed with my name in Columbus, Ohio. I have a passport. The passport has entry and exit stamps. The stamp from the Lisbon airport is dated March 20th arrival. The stamp from the return flight is dated March 27th departure. I had not been in Ohio on March 22nd. I had been in Portugal, and I could prove it with a document issued by two governments and stamped by multiple border officials and logged in an international travel record that does. I have been asked whether I contacted Ryan before filing the petition. Diana asked me this question in our second meeting, and I said no, and she said good. She said contacting him would have given him time to build a counter-narrative, and she said in these cases, the window between when the opposing party learns the evidence exists and when it is presented to a court is a window in which damage can be done, and that keeping that window closed was the correct approach. I did not tell her that not contacting Ryan was not a legal strategy so much as it was the decision I had made in my kitchen on the night I read the deed, which was that there was nothing he could say that would change what I was going to do, and therefore there was nothing useful in giving him the opportunity to try to say it. I had understood from the first reading of that document that I was not in a conversation. I was in a case, and cases do not benefit from the opposing party knowing in advance what evidence exists. The 3 seconds of pause on the phone when I had asked him what did you sign had been enough. That pause had the specific quality of a person who has done something and is adjusting in real time to the realization that the person on the other end is not going to accept the version being offered. I had recognized it, and I had said I need to see the documents, and he had sent them, and I had looked at the date and found my calendar and known in 4 minutes what had been done. I did not call him back. I sent Diana an email with 3 sentences, and she replied at 6:40 in the morning and said, "Do not contact him." And I said I had not intended to. We proceeded. Not lie about where you were on a specific date. I went very still in my apartment in Seattle. I looked at the quitclaim deed. I looked at the date. I looked at the notarization, which stated that the document had been executed on March 22nd in Franklin County, Ohio, and that the signatures of both parties had been witnessed and verified by the notary. I looked at the signature that was supposed to be mine. I am not a handwriting expert, but I have written my own name thousands of times, and I know what it looks like, and this was not it. It was a version of it. It was a passable version of it. It was a version that someone who knew roughly what my signature looked like had produced when put to the task of producing it quickly. I called a lawyer that same evening. Her name was Diana Morse, and she had been recommended to me by a colleague who had used her in an estate matter 2 years before. I explained the situation in sequence, including the date discrepancy and the passport, and Diana listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "I need you to gather several things." She said, "I need the original quitclaim deed or the county recorder's copy. I need your passport with the Portugal stamps. I need your boarding passes or any travel records from the trip. I need your conference registration, hotel confirmation, any dated receipts from Portugal." She said the date discrepancy is the foundation of everything. Everything else builds from that. I gathered what she asked for. The conference registration had been emailed to me, and I had the original email with its timestamp. The hotel confirmation had a check-in date of March 20th. I had 2 receipts from restaurants in Lisbon dated March 21st and March 23rd, paid on my credit card, which logs the location and time of every transaction. I had a boarding pass photograph I had taken at the airport the way I do with all my boarding passes. I had my passport. I sent all of it to Diana in a folder that same night. Diana filed a petition with the Franklin County Probate Court to void the quitclaim deed on the grounds of fraudulent execution. She submitted the passport as primary evidence. She submitted the conference records, the thrifty. There is something I have not mentioned about the period when I was gathering my documents for Diana. I went looking for my boarding pass photograph in my phone, and I found it in approximately 30 seconds because I keep my phone organized with the same system I apply to everything else, which is a folder for travel, and within it a subfolder for each trip with the destination and the year. The folder said Lisbon 2023, and inside it was the boarding pass photograph and the hotel confirmation email and a photograph of the view from my hotel room that I had taken on the first morning because the light was specific and I wanted to keep it, and 3 receipts from restaurants and a photograph of a tile wall I had seen in a market that had a pattern I found interesting. All of it was there. All of it was dated. All of it had either a timestamp from the phone camera or a date from the email system or a transaction date from the credit card. I had not organized this folder as an alibi. I had organized it because I travel for work regularly and keeping trip records makes expense reporting easier, and because I like to be able to find things when I need them, and I have always been a person who keeps things findable. My father kept garden notebooks in the driest cabinet in the kitchen because he wanted his records to be findable and in good condition when he needed them. My mother, who I barely know, had apparently been a woman who could not hold things still. My father kept things still. I kept things still. I had 37 dated photographs and documents from 7 days in Portugal in a folder on my phone that placed me 4,400 miles from a notary's office in Columbus on a specific date, and I found all of them in under 3 minutes when Diana asked me for documentation of the trip. Ryan had counted on me not having them. That was the error in his calculation. He knew me as the sister who had gone far away. He did not know me well enough to know what I kept. Hotel confirmation. The credit card statement showing transactions in Lisbon on dates bracketing the purported signing date. She submitted a statement from the conference organizer confirming my attendance and participation. She contacted the notary who had stamped the document. The notary was a woman named Carol Pittman, who had a commission through a business services office in Columbus. Diana's call to Carol Pittman was, by Diana's account, not a pleasant conversation for either party. Carol Pittman had notarized the document. Carol Pittman had been present when it was signed. Carol Pittman had witnessed the signature. Diana explained the passport evidence. Carol Pittman was quiet for a long time. Diana said she asked Carol Pittman to describe the person who had signed as Isabelle Thomas. Carol Pittman said the person was female, brown hair, approximately 30 years old, presented an Ohio driver's license. Diana said, "Did you verify the license photograph?" Carol Pittman said it matched the person in front of her. Diana said, "I am going to send you a photograph of my client, and I need you to tell me whether the person in the photograph is the person who signed this document." She sent Carol Pittman a professional photograph of me from my company website. Carol Pittman looked at it. Carol Pittman said, "That is not the person who signed. Someone had presented a fraudulent Ohio driver's license in my name, with my name and date of birth and a photograph of someone who was not me, to a notary in Columbus and had signed a document in my name that transferred an interest in my father's property. They had done this on a day when I was in another country and when the transfer of property through that signature was the mechanism by which my father's entire estate would end up in my brother's name." Diana presented the notary's statement to the court. She presented the passport. She presented Carol Pittman's identification of the photograph as not matching the person who had signed. She presented a handwriting analysis from a forensic document examiner named Howard Birch, who had 28 years of experience in questioned documents and who testified that the signature on the quitclaim deed showed characteristic differences from the samples of my authentic signature taken from other documents and was, in his professional opinion, not written by the same person. Ryan hired a lawyer. His lawyer argued that the execution of the deed had been in good faith, that Ryan had acted within the scope of his executor authority, and that any irregularities in the notarization process were not Ryan's responsibility. He did not address the passport directly in the initial filing. His lawyer was a competent lawyer, and competent lawyers do not address directly the evidence that is most damaging to their client until they are required to. They were required to in the response to Diana's supplemental filing, which contained the notary statement and the handwriting analysis. Ryan's lawyer's response to the passport evidence was to argue that there had been a clerical error in the dating of the document. Diana's counterfiling was 11 pages addressing the impossibility of a clerical error simultaneously affecting the notary certification, the county recorder's filing date, and the credit card and travel records of a person who was physically in another country. The hearing was on a Monday in June. The judge was a probate court judge named Martin Chung, who had the bearing of a person who has read a great many documents and has developed the specific patience of someone who allows the evidence to do its own work without assistance. He reviewed the passport. He reviewed the travel records. He reviewed Howard Birch's handwriting analysis. He reviewed Carol Pittman's statement. He reviewed Ryan's counter-arguments. He reviewed everything in the order in which Diana had organized it, and he took his time. His ruling came 8 days later. He voided the quitclaim deed in full on the grounds of fraudulent execution. He found that the signature purported to be mine had not been mine, that the notarization had been obtained through the presentation of fraudulent identification, and that the execution of the deed was therefore legally void from its inception. He ordered the property returned to the estate for proper administration under the original will. He referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential criminal charges relating to document fraud. I was in Seattle when Diana called to tell me, I sat in my apartment kitchen with my phone on the table and I looked out the window at the specific gray Seattle sky that is different from every other gray. And I thought about my father's garden in November, brown and waiting. I thought about the bowling league men crying in the parking lot. I thought about June saying your father talked about you all the time with that specific firmness that meant it was true. I thought about a passport in my bag that I had not known was going to matter and that had been stamped by a Lisbon airport official on a March morning when I was drinking bad coffee and waiting for a connecting flight, and that had been sitting there, dated for 3 months, patiently being evidence. The estate was administered properly over the following 5 months. The house on Dalton Street was appraised and its value calculated alongside the financial accounts. My father's will divided things equally between his 2 children with certain personal items specifically designated. I received the items he had designated for me, which included his watch, his record collection, and a small watercolor painting of the garden that he had commissioned from a neighbor who painted as a hobby when I was about 12. The financial distribution was processed through Diana's office with a court-appointed administrator overseeing it because Ryan had been removed as executor following the hearing. Ryan and I have not spoken since the hearing. I have thought a great deal about what I want to say when we do, and I have not yet found it. What I know is that whatever he believed he was doing when he made the choice he made, he chose it. He had the opportunity at every step to contact me, to include me, to allow the estate to be administered the way our father had intended it to be administered. He chose differently. I am not ready to call what he did forgivable. I am also not ready to call it the only thing he ever was. Both of those things are still in process. The house on Dalton Street sold in October. I did not ask to keep it. It was not the house I needed. What I needed was for the question of what my father had intended to be answered correctly, and it was. A judge read the evidence and applied the law, and what had been taken was returned to where it was supposed to go. That is enough. I have the watch and the records and the garden painting and the specific memory of my father's posture when the people he loved were in the room. And that is not nothing. That is not a small inheritance. I want to say one thing before I go that is not about Ryan and not about the legal process. It is about the passport, about the specific ordinary act of having one and keeping it and stamping it with the evidence of where you have been and when. I travel for work. I have a passport the way most people in my profession have a passport, as a tool, as a practical thing, as something you keep current and carry when you need it. I did not know on March 20th, standing in line at Lisbon Airport, that the stamp being pressed into my passport at that moment was building a piece of evidence that would be the foundation of a legal case 3 months later. I did not know that the restaurant receipt I kept on my phone for expense reporting would be the geographic timestamp that placed me 4,400 miles from a notary's office on a day someone was signing my name in that office. I did not know any of this. I just had a passport and I just kept my receipts and I just had a habit of photographing my boarding passes because I had missed a flight once at 22 by leaving a boarding pass on a restaurant table and had never made that mistake again. None of these things were protective measures. They were ordinary habits. They became, when someone put a false signature on a legal document on a day I was in another country, the most important ordinary habits I had ever maintained. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story made you feel something, write it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to hear the story of a woman whose landlord had been collecting her rent checks for 4 years without applying them to the lease, and what the bank statement audit revealed, it is waiting for you in the description below. Click it. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And if someone tells you a document was signed in your name, check where you were when it was signed. The stamps in your passport are more reliable than anyone's story. I want to tell you about Columbus in the specific way that matters to this story. My father had lived in the same house on Dalton Street for 27 years when he died. He had moved there when Ryan was 6 and I was 1. After a period of moving around that I only know about from photographs and from things my father mentioned occasionally in the past tense with the particular brevity of a person who considers the past tense to be its own adequate commentary. He had chosen the house with a specificity that I found out about only after he was gone, when I was talking with a neighbor named Frank who had lived across the street since 1994, and who told me over a cup of coffee the week after the funeral that your father looked at 11 houses before he decided on this one. He said the thing he liked about it was the lot size. He said your father stood in the backyard the first time he saw it, and he said this is enough room to grow something. Frank said it the way people say things that were told to them as self-evident facts, and that they are only now realizing contain more than was apparent at the time. My father did grow something. He grew tomatoes and pole beans, and 2 kinds of squash, and a row of black-eyed Susans along the back fence that were technically garden flowers, but that he tended with the same focused precision he brought to the vegetables. He had a specific system for everything. Stakes at precise intervals. Water at specific times of day. A note in his kitchen notebook where he recorded the date he planted each variety and the date it first produced and what the yield had been. He had been keeping this notebook since 1999. 30 years of garden records in 14 small notebooks that he stored in the cabinet above the refrigerator because he said that was the driest place in the kitchen and dried vegetables liked dry storage, and he saw no reason notebooks should be different. I have those notebooks now. They came to me in the personal property distribution, and they are the most specific thing I own, which is a different kind of specific than most things I own. Ryan had never particularly cared about the garden. He found it tedious, the daily attention it required, the repetitive work of maintenance. He had said this explicitly at various points during our childhood, and our father had never pushed him about it. My father was not a person who pushed. He did what he did, and he let other people do what they did, and he did not require alignment. I helped in the garden from the time I was old enough to be useful, and I kept helping when I came home, and the helping was one of the primary languages my father and I had that did not require words. We could work in the garden together for 2 hours without saying more than a dozen sentences, and both of us understood at the end that something had been communicated. Diana Morse was 47 years old when I first walked into her office. She had a wall of bookshelves organized with a precision that suggested someone who had arranged them once with great intentionality and maintained the arrangement as a working system rather than decoration. She had a small framed photograph on her desk of a dog of indeterminate breed looking directly at the camera with the particular expression of dogs who have figured out how cameras work. She offered me coffee and I accepted, and she made it properly, which I noted. She listened to the full account of what had happened without expression, but with complete attention. The specific attention of a person who is building something from what they hear and does not want to miss a measurement. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. How long had I been in Portugal? What documentation did I have of the trip? And had I seen the actual notary stamp on the document rather than a copy? I said a week, considerable, and yes. Diana said the notary is the most important element. She said it carefully and with the deliberateness of someone who has navigated these situations before. She said in fraudulent deed cases, the most common error the perpetrating party makes is not in the forgery itself, but in the notarization. She said most people who forge documents either skip the notarization, which immediately voids the document for certain types of transactions, or they obtain it through a notary who does not look carefully. She said the problem for them is that when a notary stamps a document, they also sign it, and their commission number is recorded and they can be contacted. She said they are the witness that does not disappear. I said I understand. She said I am going to contact this notary today. I want to tell you what it was like to wait for Diana's findings in the days after our first meeting. I was back in Seattle, at work, attending meetings, writing reports, eating lunch at my desk, doing all the things that constitute an ordinary working week. Underneath all of it was the specific suspended feeling of a person who knows a significant thing is in motion and who cannot accelerate it and must simply continue to function while it moves at its own pace. I called Diana on the 3rd day and she said she had spoken with the notary and that the conversation had been productive. I said, what does productive mean? She said it means the notary had something to tell me and told it. I said, what did she say? Diana said she is providing a written statement and I will send it to you when I have it. I said, okay. I hung up and I sat at my desk for a while and I thought about Carol Pittman looking at a photograph of me and saying, that is not the person who signed. And I thought about what that sentence means in the context of a legally notarized document, which is that the document was obtained through fraud, which is that it is void, which is that everything that flowed from it is void, which is that the house and the accounts had never actually transferred. And Ryan had called me from that driveway and told me it was all taken care of in the voice of a man describing a done thing, and it was not done. Howard Birch, the forensic document examiner, had an office in downtown Columbus in a building that had the particular institutional smell of expert witness work, paper and copy toner, and a quality of contained technical focus. Diana had arranged for me to send him authenticated samples of my genuine signature, copies of my driver's license signature, the signature on my work contracts from 3 different years, and several personal documents. He compared these to the signature on the quitclaim deed. He took 8 days to complete his analysis. His report was 22 pages. It described in specific technical language the characteristic features of authentic signatures produced by the same person, including the angle of attack, the pressure distribution, the relative proportions of letter forms, the habits of connection between letters, and the specific idiosyncrasies that develop in a person's signature over years of practice and become as individual as a fingerprint. He described each of these features in my authentic samples. He described each of these features in the signature on the quitclaim deed. He described in clinical detail the ways in which the two did not match. His conclusion was stated in one sentence at the end of 22 pages. In the opinion of the examiner, the signature purported to be that of Isabelle Thomas on the document designated Exhibit A was not produced by the same individual as the authenticated signature samples and was produced by a different person. The county prosecutor's office opened an inquiry following the judge's referral. I was contacted by an investigator named Patterson who asked me several questions over 2 phone calls about my relationship with my brother and the history of the estate administration and what I knew about how Ryan had obtained the fraudulent driver's license. I said I did not know how he had obtained it. I said I did not know who had signed in my name. I said I knew only that I had been in Portugal and that the notary had confirmed the person who signed was not me. Patterson said they were continuing to investigate. I have not been told the outcome of that investigation, and I do not know as of this telling whether charges have been filed. I know only that the referral was made and the inquiry was opened, and that those things are in a process I am not in charge of, and that the process will take the time it takes. I want to tell you something about Ryan that I have not said yet, and that I think belongs in this story because this story is not only about what he did. Ryan is a person who was shaped by specific forces that I can see more clearly now than I could when we were children inside them. He was the older child in a family organized around a father who measured value through visible present physical work, and Ryan had grown up understanding that the measure of a person was what you could show. He had organized his life around this understanding. He had been present during the illness in the visible daily way because visible daily presence was what he understood as the currency of family. He had managed the affairs because managing was what he could show. I do not think he was wrong exactly to understand that those things had value. I think he was wrong to conclude that they were the only things that had value and that the invisible things, the phone calls, the flights 4 times a year, the watching from a distance with sustained attention and sustained love, did not count in the ledger. He had looked at a ledger that did not have those entries in it and had concluded the ledger was complete. It was not complete. The entries were there. They just were not visible in the form he knew how to read. I also want to tell you about June, the woman from my father's office who told me he talked about me all the time. I found her at the reception after the funeral, and I thanked her for saying it, and she said she meant it, and she said your father showed me your picture on his phone once, when you had sent him a photograph from somewhere on a hiking trip. She said he held the phone out and said, "That is my Isabelle," in the specific voice that men of his generation use when they are proud of something and do not have the vocabulary for pride directly. She said it was a photograph of you on a mountain somewhere with snow behind you, and you were laughing at something, and your father looked at the phone and looked at me and said she figured out how to be happy, and I will never stop being glad about that. I stood at that reception holding a plate of food I was not eating, and I thought about my father showing a phone to a woman named June in an office in Columbus and saying she figured out how to be happy and I will never stop being glad. That is the inheritance that cannot be transferred through any document. That is the one that is already mine. The weeks between filing the petition and the hearing were not quiet weeks. I want to say something about grief and legal process and what it is like to be doing both simultaneously because I think this is important and because I have not seen it described accurately very often. I was grieving my father and I was building a legal case at the same time, and these two things did not separate themselves into tidy compartments. The grief was present in the legal work because every document in the case was also a document about my father, about his house and his accounts and his intentions, and the specific form in which he had chosen to distribute what he had spent 31 years building. The legal work was present in the grief because it gave me something to do with the anger that is part of grief when someone has made the grief worse through an act of choice. I had something to build against. I had a direction for the energy that grief and anger together produce when they have nowhere to go. Diana became a specific kind of ally during this period. Not a friend exactly, but the kind of professional who understands that the people who come to estate dispute attorneys are not only bringing a legal problem, they are bringing the legal problem and the grief underneath it, and the specific wound of having been betrayed by someone who was also grieving and who chose betrayal as their response to grief rather than the harder thing of being honest. She did not offer me sympathy in the performed way. She offered me competence and direction and the specific steady assurance of someone who has navigated these cases before and knows how they move and where they land when the documentation is clear. She said to me once during a call in the early weeks, "The case is solid. We are going to build it carefully and we are going to present it completely, and the judge is going to read what we put in front of him." She was right about all three of those things. She was also right in the way that good attorneys are right, which is not through prediction, but through preparation. She prepared. I prepared. We put the passport and the handwriting analysis and the notary statement in front of a judge, and he read them, and he ruled accordingly. That is the complete story of what happened when a documented truth was placed in front of someone whose job was to read it, externally or internally. I continued working in Seattle. I had meetings about watershed management and stormwater runoff, and I sat in conference rooms discussing environmental impact assessments. And I was good at my job, and I kept being good at my job because the work was real and important, and the only thing I had that was not suspended in legal process was the work. I called Diana every 4 or 5 days. She was not a person who needed to be called every 4 or 5 days. She was doing what needed to be done at the pace it needed to be done. But she took my calls with a patience that I found professionally admirable, and that she extended to me with the understanding of someone who knows that clients in estate disputes are not calling because they distrust the lawyer, but because they need to hear someone with expertise say it. It's moving, and it is solid, and you are not going to lose what you should not lose. I want to tell you about the night I first saw the quitclaim deed. After Ryan emailed it to me, I read it 3 times in sequence, and on the third reading, I went to my calendar, and I went to my travel records, and I put the date of the document execution against the dates of my Portugal trip, and I understood within about 4 minutes what had happened. I did not call Ryan back that night. I sat with what I knew for about 2 hours, and I thought about what calling him would accomplish. I thought about whether calling him and saying, "I know you signed this when I was in Lisbon," would result in a conversation that led anywhere useful. I decided it would not. I decided the useful thing was to call Diana Morse in the morning and to start building what needed to be built, so I did not call Ryan. I opened my email and I sent Diana a message with the subject line "urgent," and I attached the document, and I wrote 3 sentences. My brother emailed me this document. My signature is on it, dated March 22nd. I was in Lisbon on March 22nd, and I have my passport and receipts to prove it. Diana replied at 6:40 in the morning the next day with 4 words. Do not contact him. There was one conversation I had with my father in the last year of his life that I think belongs here. I had flown home in September, 8 months before he died, and we had sat in the kitchen the way we always sat in the kitchen, with coffee at the table, and the garden visible through the window, and the specific quality of light in that kitchen in September, which is different from the light in every other month in a way I can see but cannot describe precisely. He had been more tired than the visit before, and he was moving more carefully, and I was watching this without saying I was watching it. He asked how Seattle was. I said it was good. He asked about the job. I said it was very good. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I hope you know that going there was right." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I know Ryan thought it was wrong, and I know that mattered to you." I said it did matter to me. He said it was right. He said you built something out there, and that is what you were supposed to do. He said I would rather have a daughter who went and built something than a daughter who stayed and didn't build anything and was unhappy about it. He said this looking at the garden, not at me, the way he said important things. I said, "Thank you, Dad." He nodded once, and then he asked if I wanted more coffee. That was the conversation. I have thought about it many times since, and I think it is the most specific thing he ever said to me about who I was and what he thought of it, and I am very glad I was there for it. The house on Dalton Street had a blue tile in the kitchen that my father had installed himself in 1999. He was not a skilled tiler. This was evident from several of the tiles which were not perfectly aligned and which had a quality of having been laid with determination rather than expertise. My father was aware of this and had never made it a point of shame. He would gesture at the uneven grout lines occasionally with the specific attitude of a person who has decided that a thing done imperfectly by oneself is worth more than a thing done perfectly by someone hired. I thought about those tiles in the period after the court ruling when the house was being appraised and prepared for sale. I thought about my father laying them in 1999 with whatever tools he had available, level and trowel, and the particular focused stubbornness of a man who had decided this was a thing he was going to do himself. I thought about the garden notebooks in the cabinet above the refrigerator. I thought about 30 years of careful recorded observation of what grew and when and how much. I thought about a man who measured things and wrote them down and who raised one child who did the same thing and one who did not. Diana told me something in our meeting after the ruling that I have thought about many times. She said fraudulent deed cases are more common than most people know. She said the most typical version involves a family member, usually a sibling or a child, who has had access to the victim's identifying information for years through the normal proximity of family, and who uses that access to forge documents in a window when they believe the victim will not immediately investigate. She said the window is almost always the immediate period after a death, when grief and administrative chaos create enough noise that a document quietly filed at the county recorder's office may go unexamined for months or permanently. She said the thing that catches these cases is almost always some form of alibi evidence, a receipt, a bank statement showing a transaction in another city, a travel record. She said in your case you had multiple layers of alibi evidence that could not all be explained by any innocent interpretation. She said the passport was the cornerstone, but everything else was the walls. She said your habit of keeping documentation was not something you did for this situation. It was just something you did. And that is what made it work. I keep my receipts digitally now with the same system I had before. I photograph my boarding passes, I keep my passport current, and I note the stamps. I have a folder in my email for anything that constitutes a timestamp record of where I was and what I was doing, not because I am afraid of what might happen next. Because I understand now in a way I did not before that ordinary habits of documentation have a protective function that has nothing to do with expecting to need protection. They are the record of your actual life. And when someone tries to substitute a false version of your life in a legal document, the record of your actual life is the most powerful argument you have. I was 23 when I moved to Seattle. My father drove me to the airport himself, which was not a thing he typically did. He was not a person who made airport trips into emotional occasions. He drove me in his truck, which had a specific smell of work and old coffee, and the particular accumulation of things left on the seat that accumulate in trucks driven by practical men. He carried one of my bags to the check-in counter. He stood with me in the departure line. When I had my boarding pass and it was time to go through security, he said, "Have a good flight." I said, "I will, Dad." He said, "Call when you land." I said, "I will." He nodded. He turned and walked back toward the parking garage. I watched him go, and I thought he is not going to look back, and he did not look back. And I understood that this was how he was, and that it was not a measure of anything except the particular way he moved through the world. He called me the next morning at 7:30 to tell me that Frank across the street had said I could borrow his pressure washer anytime if I ever needed it for the driveway, which was his way of saying he was thinking about me in the form he knew how to send. Ryan's position during our father's illness was visible and present in a way that I think he genuinely believed entitled him to what he tried to take. I want to be clear about this because the easier version of this story is the one where my brother is simply a villain who saw an opportunity and seized it. I do not think that version is the accurate one. I think he had been building an accounting in his head for 2 years of what he had given and what he was owed, and the accounting seemed correct to him from inside it. He had shown up every day. He had managed everything. He had given his time and his proximity and his presence, and these were real things he had given, and they had cost him something. What he could not see from inside his accounting was that I had been giving things too, that they did not appear in his ledger because they were not visible in the forms he knew how to see, and that his decision to take unilaterally what he believed he had earned was not just wrong in its method, but wrong in its fundamental premise. What our father had owned was not payment for services rendered. It was a bequest from a man who had intended to divide it and had said so in a will. I flew home for the hearing. I stayed at the same motel I had used during my father's illness, the one near the hospital with the ice machine and the curtains that let in too much light. I ate dinner at a diner on the main road that had been there since the 1970s and had a specific laminated menu that had not been updated since approximately the same period, and that I had eaten at many times during those 2 years. The waitress was a woman who had been there the previous times I came and who said back again, in the specific neutral way of someone who has seen enough of life to accept recurrence as its own kind of answer. I said yes. She brought coffee without being asked. I ate, and I went back to the motel, and I reviewed Diana's documents for the last time, and I set them aside, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about my father saying she figured out how to be happy, and I will never stop being glad about that, to a woman named June in an office, about a photograph on his phone. I had a conversation with a colleague named Marcus 2 weeks after the ruling. Marcus had known something was happening because I had taken several unplanned calls during work hours and had needed to leave 2 meetings early and had generally had the quality of a person operating 2 parallel lives simultaneously. I had not told him what it was. After the ruling, I told him. He listened. He said, "I am sorry that happened." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I have to ask you one thing." I said, "Okay." He said, "How did you stay so steady through it?" I thought about that for a moment. I said I had the documents. He said, "What do you mean?" I said I had the passport and the receipts and the boarding pass, and I knew from the beginning that what had been done was provably false, and I think that is the thing that kept me steady. The difference between believing you are right and being able to show that you are right is the difference between 2 feet and 1 foot. You can balance on 2 feet for a long time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your brother must have thought you would just accept it." I said, "I think he did." I said, "I think he believed that the version he told would be the version that stood because he was there, and I was far away, and because he had managed everything and had the appearance of authority over it." I said he was wrong about the far away part. Far away is not the same as absent. The passport knew where I was. The garden notebooks are in my. I want to tell you one more thing about the garden. During the estate administration period, after the ruling and before the house sale, I went to Dalton Street once more. It was September, 6 months after my father had died, and the garden was in the late summer state it was always in September, which is to say productive and slightly overgrown and carrying the particular abundance of a garden that has not been harvested as often as it needs to be, because the person who tended it was no longer there to tend it. The tomatoes were split from over-ripening on the vine, the beans had gone to seed, the black-eyed Susans were still going along the back fence because they are the kind of flower that does not require maintenance to persist. I stood in that garden for a long time. I picked what was still usable, which was not much, and I left the rest. I had brought the most recent garden notebook with me, and I sat on the back step and I opened it to the last entry, which was dated March 3rd, 11 days before he died, and which said ordered seeds for the new season, Roma and Cherokee purple tomatoes, dragon tongue beans, butternut squash. He had ordered the seeds for a garden he would not plant. He had done it the way he did everything, without drama and without a great deal of visible feeling, in the specific ongoing forward tense of a person who has decided that the next thing follows from the current thing, and that stopping is not the correct response to the knowledge that things end. He ordered the seeds. I found them in a paper bag in the garage, still in their packets. I brought them home to Seattle. I have a small patio that gets partial afternoon sun, and I have put 4 container pots out there, and I am growing Cherokee purple tomatoes for the first time. They are doing well. I am keeping notes. Apartment in Seattle now in a box that I have not fully unpacked. I have taken out the most recent ones, and I have read them with the specific experience of reading something a person wrote without knowing you would read it, which is the most honest kind of reading. He recorded the garden the same way he recorded everything else in his life, with brevity and precision and without embellishment. May 15th, tomatoes in. May 22nd, first germination, Roma variety. June 8th, staked. August 4th, first harvest, yield 14 pounds. It goes on like this for 30 years. I have spent several evenings reading it from the beginning, from the first notebook, 1999, when he first laid those uneven tiles and planted his first garden on Dalton Street. And the reading has the quality of a slow, long conversation with a person who chose economy of words as his primary mode and is being, in retrospect, very economical and very clear. He planted things, he recorded what grew, he wrote down the yield every year. He noted when something failed and replanted without comment. I have been thinking about this as a model for something, not gardening specifically, the recording, the noticing and the writing down. The return every year to the same work, regardless of what the previous year produced. The patience of the long record. The watch my father left me is on my Frank from across the street called me 2 months after the ruling. He said he had heard what had happened in the way that things travel on a street where people have known each other for decades, which is to say through the specific network of morning walks and porch sits and mail conversations that constitute the information system of a neighborhood. He said he was glad it had come out right. He said your father would have been very upset about what happened. I said I know. He said Tom always said you were the one who kept things in order. He said he did not mean you were neat. He meant you kept things in their proper place. He said your father thought that was important. I said it turns out he was right about that. Frank said the seed packets had arrived in the mail 2 weeks after the funeral, and he had not known what to do with them, so he had put them in the garage. I said I found them. He said good. I said they are in Seattle now. He said Tom would like that. Wrist now. It is a Citizen automatic that he bought in 1988 and wore for 33 years, and it runs within 15 seconds per day, which is its own kind of reliability. It has a scratch on the crystal from something in approximately 2011 that I remember noticing on his wrist as a child and wondering about and never asking. It is the most used thing I own. When I look at it, I think about 33 years of a wrist and a life and a man who said call when you land and meant it as everything he could not say more directly. I said I would call, and I did, and he said good, and that was that. And now the watch is on my wrist, and I am calling from wherever I am, and there is no one to answer, and I am learning what that means slowly, the way you learn what permanent means, which is not all at once.